Are bullshots illegal? Should be a simple question, and the past decade of litigation challenging that question was a complicated, contradictory process that did end up giving us a simple answer. No, they're not. Not at all. Not as we know them today, at least. This is a topic I've been meaning to research into since forever, but the latest controversy over the Advertising Standards Authority launching an investigation into No Man's Sky makes this more timely. Steam screenshots are showing the game's creatures being bigger than they actually are, the planets prettier than they actually are, and the sky being a whole lot more crazy than it actually is. But here's the thing, the Advertising Standards Authority is an entity that can only enforce its rules in the UK, and for that matter, it's not a very powerful consumer protection entity. The most it can really do is pull ads after they've already been live for weeks, effectively already having done their job. No punitive damages, no sales damages, no refund, just a little bit of negative PR and life goes on. And that's largely the way misleading advertising law is enforced in the United States over the past few decades too. But their reasoning why may make you really, really mad. But the reasonable expectation that you'll just be a little miffed instead or think that I'm full of hot air either way is exactly the kind of logic that publishers and the law have decided can let them get away with bullshot. Bullshot is a term coined by Penny Arcade in 2005, referring to promotional images of that year's Madden that were so undoubtedly superior to the final game, or indeed anything possible at the time, that there was no denying that it was straight up, unapologetic bullshit. And the practice of bullshot must have been going through some kind of golden age during 05 and 06, churning out promotional screenshots from Madden, Red Steel, and Killzone 2 that all looked and ended up far too good to be true. But this commercial for Call of Duty 2, making a Killzone 2 style first-person pre-render that looks like gameplay, might have been the first straw on this camel's back since it was the subject of an inquiry from the very same Advertising Standards Authority looking into No Man's Sky right now. After customer complaints, the ASA's investigation did result in the ad being pulled, but not until after it ran a successful campaign for the games and the Xbox 360's launch, while further avoiding the public's ire since Call of Duty 2 ended up pretty good regardless. However, in response, he saw the next round of ads have disclaimers pop up where they weren't any before, starting with similar pre-rendered trailers for Ghost Recon Advanced Warfighter and Commandos Strike Force, while Activision simply denied their Call of Duty 2 ad for being misleading. They simply argued, quote, "The footage was intended purely to communicate the subject matter of the game rather than to represent actual gameplay." Which is the same purpose behind your typical pre-rendered FMV cinematic. Your typical World of Warcraft expansion will release with a cutting-edge expensive FMV going live on primetime TV that looks absolutely nothing like the games. Because game cameras don't move like this, game characters don't move like this whole scene looks entirely unplayable from any reasonable consumer who knows video games because, according to the Federal Trade Commission guidelines, a deceptive ad must be likely to mislead a reasonable consumer. But what about a trailer that looks like this, where the action is shown from the first-person perspective via a gun barrel on the bottom of the screen via a walking animation that is a unrealistic hover above the ground? That is how video games look, feel, and play, but the material they're showing here is of a quality way above and beyond what this game was ever able to deliver. According to a Cornell citation of U.S. false advertising law, it shall be unlawful for any person, partnership, or corporation to disseminate or cause to be disseminated any false advertisement. What exactly is a false advertisement? According to FTC guidelines, federal law states that ads must be truthful, not misleading, and when appropriate, backed by scientific evidence. And yet, when you look at how almost any goods are marketed across the entire capitalist world, you can see that those ideals are not strictly enforced at all. So I aimed to find out why. According to the good old college textbook, the FTC is responsible for protecting consumers from unfair and deceptive advertising, with deceptive ads defined as ones that have misleading aspects that are material. Which more or less means that ads can't make claims about their products by using different or fake products in the ads, which is why the pictures of fast food can get away with looking so much better than the real thing. If the ad food is made out of the same ingredients as what you order, if it's the same dish as what you order, then it's not technically a misleading ad. Even if it is a gussied up, touched up version of that food you'll never be able to order. By that logic, if a gussied up, touched up version of the game that you'll never be able to play is shown, it still passes the FTC's first test of not making a false material claim, because a build of that software did exist on the developer's machines at the time, even if it's not the same build you end up getting. Earlier this year, Kotaku interviewed a bullshot artist whose job was to touch up raw screenshots sent by devs, sometimes by replacing blurry textures, rounding up the polygons of curved surfaces, sharpening the image for high-resolution printing, or by entirely fabricating textures, HUDs, and weather effects. This may be inherently dishonest, but it's universally accepted and generally safe to do since there's still genuine product underneath all that Photoshop. Games are touched up, food is touched up, fashion models and electronics and tourism brochures all touch up their images because the representation, omission, or practice must be likely to mislead. It doesn't have to mislead, just be likely to mislead, which really sounds like the purpose of all advertising until the third test clarifies that for us, which is, it must be likely to mislead a reasonable consumer, which is a test that has one of the worst words a legal guideline can ever have, and that is reasonable. What's reasonable changes throughout time and has grown to represent what judges assume about the general population. Nowadays, people expect bullshit ads before buying a product. But on the other hand, this book does cite a lot of false advertising cases won against big businesses during the early days of television in the 60s and 70s when consumer expectations hadn't been set yet. A reasonable consumer is no longer expected to take everything they see at face value, but let's be honest here. If you're watching this channel, you're not a reasonable video game consumer. I'd like to give you the benefit of the doubt and assume most pre-release promotional materials are bullshit, but could most mainstream consumers be fooled by stuff that looks like this? I truly wonder about trailers and demos that look visibly pre-rendered to us, almost as if they're not being played at all, but still demonstrate what playing the game is supposed to be like to the general public. So hypothetically, hear me out here. If trailers like these really actually were pre-rendered animated movies instead of games, then how do companies get away with using them for advertising? Mock pre-rendered gameplay is a far, far cry away from a Blizzard-style cinematic FMV, and if the condition for passing test number 1 is that the material claims of ads have to use real products in those ads, then how can a game company get away with showing a fake demo of an entirely different piece of software to make their claim? I honestly don't know, but honestly don't think anyone will be quick to call them out on it soon because Gearbox. From the developers I've talked to, I have been told about a number of entities that aim to keep advertising in check. State attorney generals, the Better Business Bureau, private regulatory offices like the ESRB, but the one that video game legal teams really and truly fear are class action lawsuits, filed by private firms who represent large groups of people, as opposed to the FTC, which mostly deals with the much larger damages of the food and drug industries. But class action lawsuits about video games usually settle or get dismissed. In 2013, a class action lawsuit was filed against Sega and Gearbox for exactly the reason of bullshot. The suit was seeking damages for customers who felt duped by gameplay demos that were demonstrating a far more impressive gameplay than the actual game. And over the next 2 years, Gearbox fought and eventually won the fight to be dropped from the suit, arguing that it operated as a contractor and that it was Sega that had the final say on the game's marketing. In addition to that, the judge also reasoned that the definition of the gamers making up the class of the class action suit wasn't specific enough. It would have presumably included everyone in the US who bought a copy of the game, as opposed to just people who saw the misleading advertising. In addition to that, the class action was hindered by other advertising material that might have been less misleading than the much more misleading demos the case was originally about. And thus, we have a situation where bullshot is legal. Where misleading advertising is not only acknowledged, known, and grown by a huge marketing industry of people whose entire careers are built out of doctoring screenshots, but also actively defended by judges under the reasoning that it should exist because not all consumers are exposed to it. And for what it's worth, the ASA in the United Kingdom has done a more or less reliable job of getting publishers to stamp disclaimers on ads that may not be representative, as they did to Aliens Colonial Marines, but what we still have is an industry where a no-man's sky situation can arise at any given time to little to no consequence. It's typical for games to make most of their revenue shortly after launching, and the only mechanism in place stopping that is now a sudden surge of public disinterest and hype campaigns. But as long as misleading advertising campaigns are allowed to exist, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy bound to fail. Misleading advertising misleads consumers into getting hyped when they shouldn't, and either way that's still a net win for publishers. And they know. Randy Pitchford nowadays refers to the entire Aliens lawsuit as, quote, a huge waste of time, in which, quote, the market proved it was doing its job perfectly. He went on to say, the market is dispassionate, rewarding what it likes and punishing what it doesn't. There is an objectivity and fairness in the open market's harsh, firm justice. He said after Colonial Marines made a successful launch that topped sales charts because of overhyped consumers who trusted Gearbox's misleading advertising. And that might be why we've been seeing more impossible-looking trailers with less disclaimers lately compared to previous years. Because the precedent has been set. According to the industry, bullshot is not against the rules, and it's a contradictory faith in an objective marketplace which is ironically skewed by bullshot's misleading influences that is the driving force maintaining bullshot's normality. We've come to accept it. No one's surprised by it anymore, and fighting a lawsuit over it looks ridiculous. But that's the other factor here. If a reasonable consumer is presumably not affected by bullshot, then why regulate it? It's only false advertising if it's convincing enough to mislead reasonable consumers, right? We all like to believe that we're not influenced by advertising, but the statistics tell a different story. So many crappy games with good marketing, including No Man's Sky, predictably launch with wildly high sales numbers. Because false advertising law isn't about the statistics or the reality of the product. It's about whether or not the product defies consumer expectations. And at this point, the only thing that could convince a judge that your expectations were defied is if you got a completely different genre or art style than what was advertised, because the law has decided that consumer expectations for honest advertising are very, very low.